In 2018, at 15 years old, Greta Thunberg ignited the world, and she set off one of the largest movements in human history. And she stood in front of world leaders, in front of millions of people, and she said, "This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back at school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you come to us young people for hope." She said, "Right here, right now is where we draw the line. The world is waking up, and change is coming, whether you like it or not." And change is well and truly here. We're living in a defining moment of our history. This is essentially the genesis story of true and authentic climate and social action. My name is Natalie Kyriacou, and I'm the CEO of a wildlife and environmental organisation called My Green World. I'm also a climate and nature director at a firm called Pollination Group, whose aim is to shift the entire economy to net zero nature positive. And over the years, my role has evolved to one where I have the privilege of speaking at events like this, writing for a variety of publications and supporting corporates and governments in their transition to a more sustainable future. So essentially my whole life's work is exploring this intersection between social equity, nature and climate change. And today I'll be talking about ESG, or sustainability, and I'll be talking about how we collectively transition to a more sustainable future. And I'll be sharing a little bit of a roadmap with some examples of businesses and individuals that have taken steps to sort of achieve a sustainable future. Before I did delve into this though, I would like to share my own story. So I thought I would tell you about the time an orangutan stole my underwear. It was over 10 years ago, and I had the opportunity to spend a few months living and working in the Bornean jungle. So I was based in Sabah, which is East Malaysian Borneo, and I was living in a small guest house that backed onto one of the few remaining tracts of virgin rainforest in the region. I was part of an orangutan rehabilitation project, and our aim and mission was to rescue and rehabilitate orphaned and confiscated orangutans. And each day was rewarding and grueling. The weather was stiflingly hot and humid, so I would wake up each morning drenched in sweat, but I also wasn't allowed to wear deodorant or makeup or any chemical products because it would irritate the local wildlife. So, I also really stunk. And each day I bottle-fed infant orangutans. I taught juvenile orangutans how to climb. I sourced food and enrichment for local wildlife, and I had the opportunity to monitor and witness some of the world's most endangered species. But unfortunately, much of Malaysian Borneo has been devastated by deforestation, though the jungles that do remain are absolutely magical. So I was sitting in my guest house one morning and I heard a commotion out on my balcony. So I went outside to investigate, and perched on my balcony was an orangutan named Miko, who'd been recently rehabilitated. And he was holding my underwear in his hands and wringing them out. He must have seen me do the washing on previous mornings, so he was copying me. Anyway, a tug-of-war contest ensued, which I ultimately lost. And Miko retreated gleefully into the forest with my underwear decoratively hanging around his neck. And I do have photo evidence. That's Miko, and my underwear, they're still in Borneo. And later I was told that Miko was considered a rehabilitation failure. So his home in the jungle had been destroyed to make way for palm oil plantations, and his mother had been killed, leaving him an orphan. And despite the best efforts of the centre to rehabilitate him, he'd become too accustomed to human interference, and he was unable to thrive or survive on his own in the wild any longer. And Miko, to me, was symbolic of the crimes against nature that we have committed and that we continue to commit today. And this experience helped me to understand the really delicate and complex balance between human survival, ecosystems and wildlife. So after Borneo, I returned to Australia with the cocky ignorance of somebody that literally knows nothing but has been awakened by a higher purpose, you know. So dinner table conversations with my family would be trials of misery for them, not me. I was the misery maker. Dad would ask me if I wanted ice cream for dessert, and I would say, do you know palm oil is in ice cream, and one football field of virgin rainforest is being destroyed every second, and how could you possibly think I would want ice cream? In Australia, deforestation is just as bad, and there is no way I'm touching that ice cream. I was annoying and ignorant and righteously indignant and probably a little bit entitled. But I was also passionate and curious and empathetic and hoping to make a difference. So in my first week as a new master's student at the University of Melbourne, I decided I was going to turn my rhetoric into action and embark on the path that Mark Twain calls the path from cocky ignorance to miserable uncertainty. So I started my organisation, My Green World, whose aim was to develop inclusive, innovative and educational technologies to engage young people in wildlife and environmental conservation. My Green World had two main projects. One was an online classroom called Kids Corner, and the other was a mobile game app called World of the Wild, which I believe was the first mobile game app to encourage virtual wildlife conservation through game technology. It was quite innovative for its time, I think anyway. And just to give you a sense of my passion and perhaps my naivety at this time, I was a uni student when I started this, and I went all in on my new mission. So I sold my car, I moved back home with my parents, I gave up my life savings, which actually wasn't much, all to establishing My Green World. I set up fundraisers, garage sales, I sold everything. I would have sold all my family's most prized possessions if they had any. There was nothing safe around me. And so My Green World's two projects, one of them was World of the Wild, and it actually featured Miko the orangutan, and it was a mobile game app, and essentially what happened is it represented 18 global charities around the world who were working to protect wildlife and habitats. So each action that kids took in this game actually reflected a real life scenario. So you could clean up oil spills, rescue wildlife, build your own habitats, feed, provide medical care to a range of species. You could interact with other players and compete in educational pop quizzes. And you could also have the opportunity to donate and to connect to the charities that each species represented. So Miko the orangutan was in the app, and he was also represented by Borneo Orangutan Survival. And awareness around social equity and environmental action has grown at a rate I never could have imagined since starting My Green World. It is the top priority for everybody, from world leaders to CEOs to financial institutions to farmers to school teachers. But despite the progress that we make and that we continue to make in diversity and inclusion and environmental sustainability, we have a really, really long way to go. So I'd like to give you a brief snapshot of where we are in our environmental record right now. We have seriously degraded and destroyed 3/4 of our global land environments and almost the same amount of our marine environments. We have sent 1 million species to the brink of extinction. Australia, as a nation, holds the record for highest mammal extinctions. At the moment, we are on track to run out of rainforests, fish and water in our grandchildren's lifetime. This is catastrophic. Right now, the world has set a 1.5 degree target. If we exceed this, the planet becomes virtually uninhabitable for the majority of the global population. As of today, we are on track to more than double that 1.5 degree threshold. And today, women and marginalised groups, particularly Indigenous, poor and rural women, bear the brunt of the consequences of climate change. So 80% of people who are displaced by climate change are women. And despite women and marginalised groups being the most impacted by climate change, they are invisible in decision-making and leadership mechanisms that address environmental and social issues, and they are systematically denied agency in deciding when and how to overcome the vulnerabilities that they face. Women are underrepresented in governments around the world. Just 28 countries have a woman head of state or government. Only 21% of government ministers around the world are women. Only 2 Indigenous women chair a publicly listed company in Australia. There are just 18 women CEOs on the ASX 300. Less than 3% of all ASX company directors are culturally diverse women. 90% of board members in Australia are from an Anglo-Celtic background. Women are also vastly underrepresented in environmental decision-making, despite often being the invisible drivers of activist networks, science, policy reform, and community-led climate action. And here is a picture from the most recent UN Climate Change Conference, just to give you a visual of who the key global environmental decision-makers are today. In the midst of these challenges, the Australian and global landscape has been punctuated by moments of symbolism and reckoning. And the world is watching really closely as powerful policy and market signals drive an ambitious new wave of sustainability action. And the tide has shifted. We're in a new era now, and a signal has been sent to leaders, and that is diversity, social inclusion, and environmental stewardship are key determinants of a leader's ability to sink or swim. In 2019, 7.5 million people took to the streets marching for climate action. In 2021, teenagers sued the Australian government to prevent a coal mine extension in New South Wales. 8 young Australians, led by a teenage girl, teamed up with a nun to take on the largest coal mine in the state. They said the coal mine would worsen climate change and cause serious harm to them in future. When young people in the Netherlands sued their government for inaction on climate change, they won. The court ordered the government to curb emissions by 25%. A few years later, young people and NGOs teamed up in the Netherlands and they sued Shell for its contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. In an historic judgment, the court ordered Shell to slash its carbon dioxide emissions by 45%. And this ruling is having far-reaching consequences for organisations all over the world, including in Australia. Last year, a First Nations youth-led activist group made legal history, winning a landmark case to prevent a coal mine in Queensland. Young people are filing lawsuits all over the world against companies and governments. They're demanding greater environmental and social protection in the US, Australia, Canada, Netherlands, Colombia, Pakistan, Germany. In the last 2 years, we have seen a HSBC executive suspended for playing down the role of climate change. We saw Deutsche Bank raided over allegations of greenwashing. We saw Shell directors sued for failing to prepare the company for net zero. We saw a billionaire climate activist stage a takeover of Australia's largest energy generator. And we saw for the first time in Australian history our Environment Minister block a coal mine under national environmental laws. We have new global regulations that are building momentum around the world, requiring companies to disclose their climate and nature impacts. We have the largest asset managers in the world voting against directors who fail to take climate action. We have climate and nature now being factored into the economy, so we can place an economic value on things like trees, plants, soil, wildlife. We see climate change shaping elections all over the world, in Australia, Brazil, Philippines, Colombia, New Zealand, Finland. That protective cladding of profit that protected companies and governments from addressing environmental and social needs has been pierced. Now, every business and every leader is expected to truly embrace sustainability. No business can afford the economic, social, political, or environmental cost of inaction. So now we know the challenges and we know there's a flurry of voices and activity, but we're not quite clear exactly how we get there and what the role of individuals, of governments, of business is. So we do have a few overarching goals that we need to work towards. Think of these as our global goals. Our global roadmap is that we need to shift the energy mix away from fossil fuels. We need to protect and restore nature. We need to clean our air. We need to build a waste-free circular world, and we need to ensure it is a just and equitable transition. And the way that we do this is through policy and politics, through technology and innovation, and through education, mobilisation, collectivity and action. So I've outlined a series of steps, a roadmap that we can take to move from rhetoric to meaningful action. So these represent the most crucial things that companies should be doing if they want to become a sustainable organisation, but they also provide a guide for us. These are the requirements. This is what we can start demanding of organisations. This is what we should be asking of businesses that we engage with. They are setting your vision and ambition, baselining, so collecting data, understanding your organisation, governance, strategy, transformation, supply chain, innovation, finance, reporting and communicating, and advocacy. So let me take you through a few examples of how different organisations and individuals and networks have approached some of these steps. I won't go through all of them, but just a few. So step one is setting an ambition, and this means developing a company-wide vision or ambition that centres sustainability. This could be linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. And what this leads to is the ability to be able to develop a set of targets that might be net zero targets or gender quotas or targets to enhance cultural diversity through your supply chain. And Patagonia has probably the boldest and most authentic environmental ambition of any organisation in the world. So they made headlines when their founder announced that they would be transferring the ownership of Patagonia, valued at about $3 billion, to combat climate change and environmental issues. As of now, Earth is our only shareholder, the company announced. All profits in perpetuity will go to our mission to save our home planet. They are using the wealth Patagonia creates to protect the source of all wealth, that is, the environment. They have really strong ambitions, but they also live by them. So a good example of how they put their ambition into action is an advertising campaign on Black Friday shopping sales. So most companies see Black Friday shopping sales as their biggest sales day of the year. But Patagonia took out a full-page ad in the New York Times with a picture of one of their fleece jackets. And here it is. Under the image, in huge letters, it says, "Don't buy this jacket." The advertisement went on to explain in detail how unsustainable the product was, despite it being their most sustainable product. They detailed that the jacket generated 24 times the jacket's own weight in carbon dioxide and used enough fresh water to meet the needs of a small village in a day. And the ad's intention was to encourage customers to make their clothes last as long as possible by repairing instead of replacing, and to generally think before buying. So what happened next? Well, Patagonia made a record-breaking $10 million in sales, 5 times more than they predicted. So they donated it all to environmental organisations. They then set up the Common Threads Initiative, which is a marketplace of Patagonia to repair, share and recycle Patagonia gear. The next step is our baseline. So establishing a current position, collecting data and taking stock. So what's most important when we're talking about ESG or sustainability is knowing your data. Companies need to be collecting their data and understanding the impact that they're having on society and on the environment. And the importance of this data cannot be understated. So let me give you an example of how a failure to capture and communicate data can backfire. Last International Women's Day, you might have heard of this, a young couple created a Twitter bot, and this was to expose the gender pay gap amongst the world's biggest companies. So when companies tweeted their support of International Women's Day, the gender pay gap bot would retweet them. Here it is. So Goldman Sachs tweeted a message in support of women on International Women's Day, and the Gender Pay Gap retweeted the message with the text, "In this organisation, women's hourly median pay is 36.8% lower than men's." The campaign went viral, with news outlets proclaiming that the women-driven Twitter bot was striking fear in the hearts of CEOs around the world. And women said, "We don't want to see nice headshots of your female employees. We want you to tell us how you've identified your problems, what you're doing to fix them, and if you have something to shout about, if you're really doing well, show us your data." The message here is, if organisations are not effectively capturing and reporting on their data to tell their ESG stories, other people will tell their story for them. Step 3 is governance. Those at the highest level of the organisation should be assuming responsibility for delivering sustainable transformation. And if we want to know the skills, traits and qualities of an effective leader today and in future, my advice is that we need to be looking towards and sharing power with a diversity of voices, particularly towards young people. Young people have been the most powerful force in creating the modern landscape in which leaders now occupy today. And this is a landscape that challenges leaders to do better and be better. In 2015, my company, My Green World, appointed a new board member to join our advisory leadership team. His name is Isaac, and he was 8 years old at the time. And not many other companies had 8-year-olds on their board, maybe except for a couple over here. But we did, because we knew that if our mission was to engage young people in environmental conservation, we needed to hear from young people. We were talking about environmental education every day, and what better person to seek advice from than a young person who is receiving that education. So Isaac joined the board meeting, which took place at the zoo, and his parents sat quietly in the background, and he gave us a presentation on the state of wildlife and the environment in Australia. And then we had a discussion about how we could better have more impact in schools through our environmental program. And Isaac provided insight and advice that was instrumental to our work. He shared his own experiences as a student. He offered some insight into some of the gaps that he was experiencing in his own education, and we implemented the suggestions that he made. Young people also teach us to be better leaders and communicators. So a few years ago, I was asked to give a speech at my former workplace, PwC, and instead I asked if 8-year-old Isaac could speak in my place. So Isaac came to PwC wearing his suit that had pictures of sharks on it, and he gave a wonderful speech on the state of environment in Australia. And we then opened up the room for questions, and we gave people an opportunity to ask Isaac questions, but we also allowed Isaac to ask PwC questions. Isaac asked PwC, the room at PwC, what they did for a living. Have you ever been in a room full of consultants when they're asked, what do you do for a living? The room was silent. And this is the problem. And it's a huge learning experience for us. How can we, as leaders, be expected to govern effectively, to communicate with impact, to communicate what we're doing, what we're trying to achieve and who we are, if we cannot even explain it to a kid, if we cannot explain it in a way that is accessible to all? How do we do our jobs effectively if we cannot articulate what we do? Kids teach us to think better, to think differently, to frame problems in different ways, to understand the world through a different lens. And leaders cannot underestimate the power and impact of young voices. They are our customers. They are our current and future workforce. They are the shapers of our policy. They are the heirs to the planet. They are the architects of the climate movement. They are the power behind the civil rights movement, the Arab Spring, the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the Me Too movement. They are teaching us how to lead and be led. And they are helping us overcome the challenges that sometimes we as adults don't even know exist. Another critical step is activating your supply chain. So working with suppliers is a really powerful way to inspire others to collectively take action and drive sustainability initiatives. And I'm going to talk about a carpet company, which sounds really boring, but it's amazing. Has anybody heard of Interface? Interface is, we probably haven't, because it's one of the world's most successful carpet companies. It's a $1 billion flooring company, essentially, and in the 1990s, the CEO, Ray Anderson, was asked by a customer, what is your company doing for the environment? And this was the moment that everything changed. It sent Ray into a frenzy. He started reading environmental books and following environmental experts and becoming aware of the environmental crisis that nobody was really talking about. So the CEO, Ray, the following week came into work and he announced to his entire workforce that he had had an awakening and that now the new company mission was centred around the environment, not carpet. He told them everything is changing now. So the staff naturally thought he was insane and assumed that his newfound passion would be a fad. It wasn't. Ray went on to set up a global task force of the world's leading environmental experts to help shape his sustainability journey. He gathered over 1,000 people for a sales and strategy weekend, and he told them it was all about strategy and growth. But it was actually a climate intervention where he spent the whole weekend telling them about the climate change crisis, and it was dedicated to explaining to them how they needed to take better climate action. Through Interface, he also had to build an entirely new market. Their their suppliers had no idea what an environmentally sustainable carpet was. So Ray worked closely with suppliers to make changes to raw materials, to change manufacturing processes. And then he went to his competitors and he told his competitors what he was doing, and he said, well, I'm saving this much money. You need to get on board. We need more suppliers supplying these sort of materials. And so he essentially built an entirely new sustainable carpet industry and supply chain. He created demand across the entire industry. And he also had a greater focus on zero negative impact. So everything he did had zero negative impact on climate, on environment and nature. His suppliers even started making carpet from discarded fishing nets, and they invented a new carpet tile that reduced waste. In 1994, Ray Anderson brought his new sustainability vision to a group of Wall Street investors, and this was shortly after his awakening. He said to them, I don't want to talk about numbers. He was going to talk about climate change. It was not well received. The investors panicked and stocks dropped. So the next day, Ray received a phone call from one of their biggest investors who had dumped the stock and the investor said, Ray's clearly gone round the bend. Ray's response, part of the job as CEO means being round the bend so you can see what's coming up next. Today, Interface is the largest and most successful flooring company in the world and one of the leading companies in sustainability. A final step I would like to touch upon is the role of advocacy, engagement and influence. So we are seeing the rise of the activist leader. Leaders are confronting environmental and social issues head on. They're doing it loudly and they are doing it en masse. Has anybody ever seen this photo? This photo was taken at COP26, the Global Climate Change Conference. Tuvalu's foreign minister delivered a speech at the United Nations conference standing knee-deep in seawater to show how his low-lying Pacific nation is on the front line of climate change. He said, "We are sinking." Already, 2 of Tuvalu's 9 islands are on the verge of going under, swallowed by rising sea levels. Tuvalu will not survive the climate crisis. Leaders around the world, like this, are stepping up. This is the new expectation. It is no longer praiseworthy to take a stance on environmental and social issues. It is the bare minimum. You don't need to stand knee-deep in seawater to advocate and influence, but we all do have to do something. Not speaking up when you have the opportunity to is no longer acceptable for leaders. So there you have it. That is the roadmap with a few concrete examples that I hope are somewhat helpful. I'll just show you one more time. So I've given you a few examples of how various organisations and leaders and communities are trying to drive change across each of these sort of areas, but you also can visit the app, and on the app we've uploaded a more detailed overview of these steps with also links to recommended links that I've provided and a range of books, so feel free to check those out. And individually, we have a pretty similar role to play. So there are a few steps that we can take to ensuring that we're collectively following the roadmap to ensure a more environmentally and socially just future. So first is understand the issues. Develop your literacy in climate change, nature and social equity. 2, understand the expectations that are on businesses and governments and hold them to account. Governments need to be setting the policies and the foundation that pushes and incentivises business to adopt these practices, and then businesses need to adopt them. Ensure your daily conversations and your individual and business decisions are guided by this roadmap, are guided through the lens of environmental sustainability. And 4, ask the right questions. This can simply mean asking questions to any of your business associates. How are you working to phase out fossil fuels? What's your environmental impact, including through your supply chain? Or show me your environmental data. It is completely reasonable to ask for data. The targets and goals for sustainability and environmental protection have been designed over the last 50 years. There is no shortage of ambition, but we do need action now. And our failure to address climate change over the past half-century has left us with little choice but to mobilise a wartime-like effort to address this challenge. So if I could be so bold as to give one parting piece of advice or perhaps reminder, it would be do whatever you can, whenever you can, no matter how small, to protect future generations and future environments, because all of us in this room right now are the last remaining generation that actually has the ability to stop the climate crisis from unfolding. And for businesses reluctant to embrace change, I would say listen to the wise words of the environmentalist David Brower, who says, "You can't do business on a dead planet." Thank you.